In 1923, an entire village of 600 people vanished overnight. They did not take their belongings. They did not pack food or clothing. They left no trail of where they might have gone. What they did leave behind was silence, an emptiness so complete that when travelers stumbled into the settlement, they could hardly believe what they were seeing. 600 souls, gone as if they had been swallowed whole by the earth. The village was called Hoer Verde. It sat quietly in the Brazilian countryside, surrounded by thick jungle and distant hills. It was the kind of place where life was simple, where families worked the fields, raised children, and found comfort in their routines. For years it thrived in its isolation, and yet, in a single night, all of that life disappeared. The travelers who arrived that morning expected to hear voices, the sounds of animals, the clatter of daily life. Instead, they heard nothing but the low hum of wind through the trees, the distant cries of birds circling above, and the faint creak of doors left ajar. They walked into kitchens where meals had been abandoned in the middle of preparation, pots still on stoves, bread left half-cut, plates waiting to be served. Fields still bore tools dropped in the dirt, as though farmers had vanished mid-task. The village felt frozen in time, like a play abruptly interrupted in the middle of a scene. And then came the most haunting discovery. In the schoolhouse, where children once gathered for lessons, every desk was empty. On the blackboard, half a lesson remained scrawled in chalk, its words trailing into nothing. And beside it, written in large, desperate letters, was a single phrase: "There is no salvation." No bodies were ever found. No records explain what became of the villagers. The fate of Hoer Verde remains a puzzle with no solution, a story carried only in whispers and fragments. Some believe it was fear of war that drove the people away. Others claim something darker moved through the jungle that night, something not meant to be seen. You are listening to the Macabre record. Before we step deeper into this mystery, make sure you subscribe so you never miss another unsettling tale, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Before the silence, Hoer Verde was alive. It was not a village of wealth or power, nor a place known beyond its borders, but it had all the hallmarks of a thriving little community. Tucked deep within Brazil's countryside, it lay cradled between dense stretches of jungle and the open farmland that sustained its people. The paths were narrow, carved from dirt and stone, lined with modest homes of wood, clay, and thatch. From sunrise to sunset, those paths bustled with the rhythm of ordinary lives. Men worked in the fields with crude but sturdy tools. Women traded goods in the square, and children filled the air with their laughter as they chased one another through the village lanes. The story of Hoer Verde begins with silence, and it ends with silence. Nearly 100 years have passed since 600 men, women, and children vanished overnight, leaving behind homes, belongings, animals, and a phrase that still chills every retelling: "There is no salvation." Explanations have come and gone. Political unrest, military action, migration, disease, curses, even forces beyond this world. Yet none of them can account for the totality of what was left behind. None can explain how an entire community could disappear without bodies, without trails, without proof. What lingers is not clarity, but absence. A village frozen mid-breath, a meal half-prepared, a child's lesson left unfinished, a chalkboard scrawled with words that echo across a century. These fragments tell us little of what truly happened, but they tell us enough to feel its weight. They tell us that life can be interrupted in an instant, and that some stories will never find their ending. Perhaps the people of Hoer Verde fled into the jungle, driven by fear we can no longer trace. Perhaps they were taken by soldiers whose actions were buried by silence. Or perhaps something stranger still crept into the village that night, something no words could capture, leaving only a message of despair for those who would follow. We will never know. And maybe that is the cruelest part of all. that the questions endure, but the answers do not. Mysteries like Hoer Verde endure because they mirror our deepest fears. We fear not just death, but erasure. We fear vanishing without explanation, without remembrance, without salvation. And so this village, swallowed by time and silence, becomes more than a story of 600. It becomes a story of us all, a reminder that certainty is fragile and that the unknown is never far away. You have been listening to the Macabre record. If the mystery of Hoer Verde is so unsettled you, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale of darkness and disappearance. And before you go, tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from. The village of Hoer Verde may be gone, but tonight its silence has reached you. The story of Hoer Verde begins with silence, and it ends with silence. Nearly 100 years have passed since 600 men, women and children vanished overnight, leaving behind homes, belongings, animals, and a phrase that still chills every retelling: there is no salvation. Explanations have come and gone: political unrest, military action, migration, disease, curses, even forces beyond this world. Yet none of them can account for the totality of what was left behind. None can explain how an entire community could disappear without bodies, without trails, without proof. What lingers is not clarity, but absence. A village frozen mid-breath, a meal half prepared, a child's lesson left unfinished, a chalkboard scrawled with words that echo across a century. These fragments tell us little of what truly happened, but they tell us enough to feel its weight. They tell us that life can be interrupted in an instant, and that some stories will never find their ending. Perhaps the people of Hoer Verde fled into the jungle, driven by fear we can no longer trace. Perhaps they were taken by soldiers whose actions were buried by silence. Or perhaps something stranger still crept into the village that night, something no words could capture, leaving only a message of despair for those who would follow. We will never know. And maybe that is the cruelest part of all, that the questions endure but the answers do not. Mysteries like Hoer Verde endure because they mirror our deepest fears. We fear not just death, but erasure. We fear vanishing without explanation, without remembrance, without salvation. And so this village, swallowed by time and silence, becomes more than a story of 600. It becomes a story of us all, a reminder that certainty is fragile, and that the unknown is never far away. You have been listening to the Macabre record. If the mystery of Hoer Verde unsettled you, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale of darkness and disappearance. And before you go, tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from. The village of Hoer Verde may be gone, but tonight its silence has reached you. Each morning began with the call of roosters, the sound spilling through windows as families prepared for another day. Smoke curled from chimneys, carrying the smell of beans and corn simmering over fire. The ringing of church bells would often drift across the settlement, calling the devout to prayer. And by midday, the square was alive with barter, conversation, and greetings exchanged in the warmth of familiarity. The villagers were not strangers to hardship. Living so far from the modern world demanded resilience, but theirs was a life of routine, a rhythm that gave stability in a world beyond their control. The schoolhouse stood as the heart of that rhythm, a single-room building where children gathered to learn letters, numbers, and hymns. It echoed with the shuffling of feet and the scratch of chalk against board. Lessons were simple but meaningful, binding the community to a future beyond mere survival. And when the sun dipped low, families would gather around lanterns and firelight, sharing meals seasoned with laughter and quiet stories of ancestors who had walked these same paths. Hoer Verde was a place of continuity, a link between the old ways of the land and the hope of what might come. And yet, this continuity was fragile. For all its warmth, Hoer Verde stood isolated, its people reliant on one another and vulnerable to forces they could not control. When life vanished here, it was not only bodies that were lost, but the pulse of a world that had seemed so steady. That is what makes their disappearance all the more haunting, the knowledge that behind every abandoned home was once a story, a family, and a life cut short without explanation. When travelers first approached Hoer Verde in 1923, they expected the same signs of life that had greeted them in countless villages before it. Smoke rising from cooking fires, children darting between the houses, the murmur of voices drifting through the air. Yet, as they drew nearer, the first thing they noticed was the absence of sound. No chatter, no footsteps, no distant calls of animals, only the monotonous hum of the jungle, pressing in from every side. At first, they assumed the villagers might have gathered for some communal event, a celebration perhaps, or a religious service that drew everyone into a single space. But as they stepped deeper into the heart of the village, unease took root. The streets lay deserted. Doors stood ajar, creaking faintly as the wind pushed against their hinges. Dust shifted in the open paths, undisturbed by human feet. Even the air felt heavier, as though whatever energy once filled this place had been drained away, leaving behind a hollow shell. One of the travelers recalled later that it was not just the silence that unnerved them, but the sense of interruption. It was as if life had been halted mid-breath. A wooden cart sat abandoned with half its load of goods still inside. A chair tipped sideways on a porch, as though someone had risen quickly and never returned. The world around them felt frozen, but not in peace. Frozen in sudden flight, in the moment of panic, where people drop everything and vanish. The group called out, their voices breaking the stillness, hoping for some answer. But no one answered. No footsteps approached. Only the echo of their own words bounced back against the wooden walls of the homes. With every unanswered call, the weight of the village's emptiness grew. They knew even then that what they had stumbled upon was not natural. Something was wrong. And so they pressed on, step by cautious step, determined to uncover where 600 men, women and children had gone. What they would find in the hours ahead would not bring answers. Instead, it would raise questions that have haunted history for more than a century. For in Hoer Verde, silence was only the beginning. The first house they entered told them everything and nothing all at once. Inside, the air was thick and stale, as though it had been sealed for days, yet the signs of life were everywhere. A poeuse, tias of food, sat on the stove, burned at the edges, but unmistakably left in the middle of cooking. A loaf of bread, half sliced, rested on a wooden board beside a knife that looked as though it had been dropped hastily. A clay cup had tipped on its side, its contents dried into a sticky stain across the table. Nothing was packed. Nothing was missing. It was as if the family who lived here had simply stepped outside for a moment, only to never return. Moving to another home, they found the same strange interruptions. A cradle rocked gently as if disturbed by their footsteps, though no child lay inside. Clothing was spread out on a bed, perhaps prepared for the day ahead, but the room itself was empty, its silence pressing against the intruders with unnatural weight. One traveler whispered that it felt as if they were walking through the aftermath of some invisible disaster, one that left no marks, no scars, only absence. The more houses they entered, the stranger the pattern became. In each one, lives had been left unfinished. In one kitchen, vegetables were still laid out to be cut, knives resting beside them. In another, plates of food sat untouched, gathering flies. What unsettled them most was not what was missing, but what remained. People do not leave behind food when they are hungry. They do not abandon clothing when they are preparing for a journey. And yet, here in Hoer Verde, every home was a shrine to interruption, frozen mid-breath. The group began to feel watched, though no eyes met theirs. Every doorway seemed to gape like an open mouth, every window a hollow stare. The silence was no longer absence. It had become a presence of its own, a suffocating reminder that something was deeply wrong. Still, they pressed forward, certain that somewhere in the village they would find the answer. What they found instead would deepen the mystery beyond anything they could have imagined.
The search through the homes had shaken the travellers, but it was the schoolhouse that left them truly disturbed. At first glance, it looked like any other building in the village, a single-room structure with wooden shutters that creaked in the wind. The door was slightly ajar, and when they pushed it open, the faint smell of chalk and dust drifted out. Inside, the air was heavy, still holding the ghost of children's voices that should have been echoing within its walls. Desks sat neatly in rows, as though class had ended only moments earlier. Slates were left on tabletops, some still marked with half-written numbers and letters. A child's satchel lay open on the floor, spilling out its contents as if dropped in haste. The room was not abandoned in order. It was abandoned in chaos, mid-sentence, mid-lesson, mid-thought. To the travellers, it felt as if time itself had been interrupted, leaving the village frozen in a moment of sudden flight. And then they saw it. On the blackboard, where the teacher's hand had scrawled a lesson that trailed off unfinished, there were larger words, written hurriedly, in a heavier hand. Words that did not belong to a child's exercise or a teacher's careful instruction. Words written with desperation. There is no salvation. The letters were uneven, jagged, pressed so deeply into the chalk that flakes of dust clung to the wooden ledge below. The travellers stood frozen, staring at the phrase, their minds scrambling for explanation. Was it a warning? A prophecy? A statement of despair? And who had written it? The teacher? A fleeing villager? Or someone else entirely? One man muttered that it must have been a joke, a cruel prank left by whoever had passed through the village before them. But the words felt heavy, carved with intention, and the silence surrounding them made any thought of humour impossible. The group exchanged uneasy glances, and a wave of dread swept over them. It was not just that the people were gone, it was that the last trace of them was a message that spoke of hopelessness, of doom, of something from which there could be no escape. The discovery left them shaken to their core. They had come searching for answers, but what they found instead was a question far more chilling. Salvation from what? The travellers stood in the schoolhouse longer than they should have, staring at the chalkboard as if the words themselves might rearrange into something less terrifying. But they never did. The phrase remained fixed, etched into their minds, and the silence of the abandoned classroom pressed down heavier with every passing second. Finally, one of them broke the stillness with a nervous laugh, insisting that it had to be some cruel joke, some meaningless scribble left by mischievous children. Yet even he could not bring himself to look away from the jagged letters, and his voice trembled as he spoke. When they stepped back outside, the village no longer felt like an empty settlement. It felt haunted, not by spirits they could see, but by the absence of the 600 souls who had lived here. Fear crept into the group, subtle at first, like a whisper in the back of the mind. They began to quicken their steps, calling out once more in the hope that someone, anyone, would answer. But the only reply was the echo of their voices and the rustle of the jungle beyond the huts. One of the men suggested leaving at once. "This place is cursed," he muttered under his breath. Another argued they should stay, that surely some clue lay waiting in the village that would explain what had happened. Their voices rose with agitation, the unease fraying into panic. They argued not because they disagreed, but because fear demanded an outlet, and anger was easier than silence. The longer they remained, the more oppressive the air became. Shadows stretched across the ground as the sun tilted west, and the once simple dirt paths seemed to twist into something unfamiliar. A few of them swore they felt eyes on their backs, though every hut they passed remained as empty as the last. The weight of the mystery pressed against them,
And though they found no evidence of violence, no signs of struggle, the village felt like a crime scene, a place marked by something unseen and unknowable. And yet, even in their fear, curiosity dragged them forward. Something about the abruptness of the disappearance demanded answers, but every step deeper into Hoer Verde left them with the growing realization that there would be none. The further the travelers went, the more unbearable the silence became. They had already searched the homes and the schoolhouse, but as they moved outward, they found signs of life that made the absence of people even harder to comprehend. Chickens wandered the dusty paths, their feathers ragged, pecking listlessly at the ground. A thin dog padded through the square, ribs showing beneath its fur, tail low, eyes darting nervously between the strangers. The animals were still alive, but barely. They had been left untended, unfed, abandoned in the same sudden moment that had claimed their owners. In the fields beyond the huts, tools lay scattered among the furrows. A plough stood half buried in soil, as if the farmer guiding it had simply let go and vanished. Into thin air. Wooden baskets filled with crops sat overturned, their contents rotting beneath the sun. The air buzzed with insects, but there were no human voices to chase them away. Everything spoke of interruption, of a life that had been carried out in rhythm one moment and utterly destroyed the next. The travelers tried to reason with what they saw. Perhaps the villagers had fled, yes, fled suddenly, in fear of something approaching. But why leave behind livestock, their only source of food and survival? Why abandon belongings without even the simplest attempt to carry provisions into the jungle? And most troubling of all, why had there been no struggle? No footprints leading away? No evidence of where 600 people could have gone? One man suggested that perhaps a sickness had struck the village, forcing everyone to scatter in desperation, but the others dismissed it. Where were the bodies, the signs of illness? Another whispered the possibility of an attack, but again, the silence of the place refuted it. The huts were not burned, no blood marked the ground, and no weapons lay abandoned in haste. The group began to feel the weight of impossibility itself. They were not simply walking through a deserted settlement. They were walking through a paradox, a scene that should not exist. And though the emptiness offered no answers, the traces left behind spoke louder than words. Whatever had driven the villagers from their homes had come swiftly and completely, leaving nothing but silence, starvation, and a phrase on a chalkboard that promised no salvation. As the sun lowered in the sky and the shadows of Hoer Verde stretched longer, the travelers gathered at the edge of the square, each one grasping for explanations that might restore some sense of reason to what they had seen. One man argued that the villagers must have fled suddenly, perhaps driven by the chaos of the outside world. Brazil in 1923 was far from stable. Armed groups, rebels and soldiers often roamed the countryside. If the sound of gunfire or the threat of raiders had reached the ears of Hoer Verde, it was possible the people had chosen to vanish into the jungle rather than risk slaughter. The others listened, and for a moment the theory seemed plausible, but then the contradictions mounted. If they had fled in haste, why had they not taken food? Why had they left clothing, tools and animals, things essential to survival in the wild? A flight born of fear might explain the suddenness, but it could not explain the recklessness. No group, much less an entire village, would walk into the jungle empty-handed. Another voice suggested plague. Perhaps disease had swept through the settlement, and the villagers fled to escape contamination. Again, at first it seemed possible. Fear of sickness can drive people to abandon even their closest kin. But there were no signs of illness in the homes, no bodies, no burial pits, no marks of fever or blood. The food that lay rotting on tables had not been touched. The livestock were untouched too, thin but alive. If disease had struck, it had left behind no trace. A third man muttered about bandits, but even that theory crumbled under inspection. Bandits did not leave food behind. They did not walk away without looting, and no band of raiders, however ruthless, could have taken 600 people alive without leaving evidence of violence. Theories rose and fell like sparks in the night, each one flaring briefly, only to be smothered by the weight of what the travellers had seen with their own eyes. The homes spoke of panic, but not of violence. The fields spoke of interruption, but not of departure. And the chalkboard spoke of something else entirely, something no theory could make rational, a message of despair, written for no one, echoing into history. The travellers were left with the worst explanation of all, the absence of any explanation at all. To understand the theories that rose around Hoer Verde, one must look beyond the village itself, to the country that surrounded it in 1923. Brazil at the time was not the nation of modern cities and industry it would later become. It was a country unsettled, a land where political divisions cut deep and unrest often bled into violence. The First Republic was struggling, its leaders losing control over regions far from the capital. In rural Brazil, law was not written in ink, but enforced by whoever carried the most guns. Armed bands roamed the countryside, some loyal to political factions, others answering to no one but themselves. They raided farms, seized supplies, and vanished back into the wilderness before soldiers could respond. For villagers in isolated settlements like Hoer Verde, the threat of violence was constant, lingering at the edges of every peaceful day. Rumors of armed men traveling from town to town could spark panic, and panic could spread like fire through communities already cut off from protection. Some historians argue that this climate of fear provides the most reasonable explanation for what happened. If word had reached Hoer Verde of soldiers or bandits approaching, the villagers may have believed they had no choice but to flee, abandoning their homes in a desperate bid for safety. It was not uncommon for families to leave behind possessions when fear took hold, hoping only to survive long enough to reclaim them later. And yet, even this theory raises questions. Fear of violence could explain why people ran, but not why they left everything in disarray. It could not explain why food was still cooking, why belongings were untouched, why animals were left to starve. Nor could it explain the chalkboard message, written not in haste, but in something darker, something deliberate. If they had fled an enemy, why leave words of despair behind? Why proclaim that there was no salvation? The unrest of Brazil in 1923 provides a backdrop, but it does not solve the riddle. Instead, it casts the disappearance in sharper relief. If fear drove the villagers into the jungle, why did no trace of them ever surface? 600 people do not simply vanish without a sound. Among the theories that lingered over Hoer Verde, one of the most persistent was that the disappearance was no mystery at all, but a deliberate act of force. Brazil in the 1920s was scarred by political struggle, and rural villages were sometimes swept up in conflicts they neither started nor understood. To some, the idea that soldiers or armed factions might have descended on Hoer Verde seemed the simplest explanation. Perhaps the villagers had been forced to march away at gunpoint, compelled to abandon their homes in a matter of minutes. It was not unheard of. Records from the time speak of villages emptied by conscription raids or families scattered by advancing militias. Soldiers needed food, supplies, and sometimes labor. A village like Hoer Verde could easily have been seen as expendable, its people nothing more than resources to be seized in the name of order. To those who leaned on this explanation, the empty homes and abandoned meals were not mysteries, but the echoes of an invasion that left no room for resistance. And yet the theory begins to crumble under closer inspection. Armies leave marks. Even the most disciplined unit leaves behind footprints, campfires, or discarded supplies. A group of 600 people herded into the wilderness should have left trails beaten into the earth, evidence of their passage. But no such traces were ever found. The jungle around Hoer Verde was thick, yes, but it was not infinite. If 600 villagers had been marched away, searchers would have stumbled upon their path sooner or later. Even more troubling was the absence of violence. If soldiers had come, there should have been damage, broken doors, burned buildings, possessions ransacked. Yet the homes of Hoer Verde were untouched. Nothing was stolen, nothing destroyed. Livestock wandered freely, ignored. No shots fired, no bodies left behind. It was as if the supposed army had appeared only to demand departure and then vanished without a single mark of their presence. But armies are not silent. They do not vanish without trace. They do not leave behind cryptic warnings scrawled in chalk. There is no salvation does not sound like the order of a soldier. It sounds like despair, written by someone who believed their fate had already been sealed. If Hoer Verde had been taken by force, then it was a kind of force history has never properly recorded, a force invisible, untraceable, and perhaps not human at all. There are those who insist that Hoer Verde's people were not taken, but that they left of their own will. The theory of mass migration suggests that the villagers decided, collectively, to abandon their settlement and seek life elsewhere. Brazil in the 1920s was shifting, after all. Industrial growth was pulling people from the countryside into towns and cities. New opportunities, new roads, and whispers of land in other regions may have lured the villagers away. Perhaps, this theory suggests, Hoer Verde was simply left behind like an empty shell, its people choosing to start again somewhere far from their isolated corner of the world. At first glance, the idea almost makes sense. Rural families had long moved in search of better fortune. Whole villages had uprooted before, chasing work or fleeing hardship. Yet even as the possibility is raised, it falters against the peculiar evidence left in Hoer Verde. If the villagers had planned to migrate, why had they left everything behind? A migration deer, Iman's preparation, tools for farming, food for survival, clothing, livestock. Yet in Hoer Verde, all of these were abandoned. The homes were not cleared, not emptied, but frozen mid-use. A family planning to start anew would not walk away from their possessions, only to step into the wilderness with nothing. The strangeness of the scene only deepens this contradiction. Meals half prepared sat in kitchens. A cart stood loaded, but unfinished. Work in the fields was interrupted in the middle of the task. This was not the careful order of a community relocating. This was something abrupt, sudden, and terrifying. People do not leave mid-bite when they are migrating. They do not vanish without packing when they intend to survive elsewhere. And still, the most haunting element remains the schoolhouse. If the villagers had left by choice, if they had walked away in hope of a better future, who would have stayed behind to carve words of despair across the chalkboard? Who would declare that there was no salvation if their path was chosen freely? The theory of migration tries to make the mystery ordinary, tries to turn it into the story of a village that moved on. But the evidence resists such simplicity. The truth of Hoer Verde lies not in order, but in chaos, not in hope, but in something far darker. Beyond the politics and the theories of migration, another explanation took hold, one rooted not in history, but in folklore. For centuries, the Brazilian wilderness has been a place of mystery, whispered about in stories passed from generation to generation. The jungle is not just trees and vines, not just birds and rivers. To those who live close to it, it is alive in ways that cannot always be explained. It shelters, but it also devours. It gives, but it also takes. And in its darkest corners, many believe, it hides things that should not be seen. The people of rural Brazil told tales of spirits who guarded the forests, jealous of those who settled too close. There were stories of curses that befell communities who ignored warnings from the land itself. Children grew up hearing of phantom figures who lured the unwary deeper into the trees, never to return. It is in this atmosphere of myth and fear that some place the story of Hoer Verde. Perhaps the village had offended something ancient, something that demanded silence as payment. Others spoke of the Curupira, a creature said to roam the jungle, protector of its secrets, punisher of those who disrespected the natural world.
His footprints were said to point backward, confusing anyone who tried to follow. If Hoer Verde's people vanished, some claimed, perhaps it was the Curupira leading them away, driving them into the forest where none could ever find them. There were also whispers of encantados, shape-shifting spirits tied to rivers and waters, capable of luring entire groups into their realm. To skeptics, these tales were nothing more than superstition, born from fear of a wilderness that could not be tamed. Yet to those who heard the story of Hoer Verde, the legends seemed to fit too well. 600 people, gone without trace, belongings untouched, animals left behind. Such a thing did not feel human, it felt Lee's. 'Tis something out of myth, something that could only be explained by forces beyond comprehension. And then there was the message on the chalkboard. There is no salvation. A phrase that sounded less like a man's words and more like a curse. If the villagers believed they were being punished, if they believed they had crossed some invisible boundary, then perhaps the message was not meant for outsiders at all. Perhaps it was their own final admission, that whatever had come for them, it would not let them go. The words on the chalkboard linger like a ghost over every theory of Hoer Verde. There is no salvation. 4 words, scratched in chalk, but heavy enough to outweigh 600 missing lives. Who wrote them, and why? Were they the last message of a single desperate villager, or the voice of the community itself, a collective confession scrawled for anyone who might come after? Or were they something else entirely, a message not from the villagers, but for them? Some imagine a teacher, staying behind as panic swept the village, watching desks empty in a rush of confusion. Perhaps she wrote it in despair, knowing whatever force had taken her neighbors would soon claim her too. Others picture a child, copying words given to them without understanding, leaving behind a phrase that captured the hopelessness of those final moments. There are those, too, who whisper that the hand which wrote the message may not have belonged to a villager at all, that it was the hand of an outsider, someone who wished to leave behind a warning, or a mark, or perhaps even a cruel puzzle for those who came later. The phrase itself is haunting in its ambiguity. No salvation from what? From war? From poverty? From disease? Or was it salvation in the spiritual sense? The absence of God's mercy, a final recognition that whatever fate awaited them lay beyond redemption. In a country where faith ran deep, such words were not casual. They carried weight, and the weight they carried was despair. And yet, the message could also be read differently, not as despair, but as defiance. A statement that salvation was impossible, not for themselves, but for whoever followed. Perhaps it was not the voice of the vanquished, but a curse thrown into the silence, daring any who entered to meet the same fate. What unsettles most is not just the words themselves, but the manner in which they were written. They were not hurried or scrawled in panic. They were deliberate, pressed into the board as though carved by a steady hand. Whoever wrote them had time to choose each letter, to leave behind a message they knew would outlive them. It was less a cry for help than a verdict, a final judgment delivered to the empty room that echoes still. As the travellers pushed further through the village, they began to notice another detail, one that seemed small at first, but soon became impossible to ignore. The people of Hoer Verde were gone, yet their animals remained. Chickens clucked aimlessly in the dust, scratching for food no one had scattered. A horse stood tethered in the shade, ribs sharp beneath its skin, stamping restlessly as though waiting for a master who would never return. Dogs, lean and wary, paced the edges of the square, their eyes darting to the strangers with a mixture of fear and hunger. The presence of the animals raised more questions than it answered. If the villagers had fled, why would they not have taken their livestock? In a rural settlement, animals were not luxuries, they were survival. Her chickens provided eggs, goats provided milk, and horses were lifelines for transport. No one in their right mind would abandon such vital resources. not unless their departure had been so sudden that they hadn't even the time to untie a rope or open a gate. But there was something else about the animals that unsettled the travellers. They seemed restless, skittish, as though they too sensed that something unnatural had passed through the village. The dogs barked at nothing, their howls echoing in the emptiness. The chickens scattered at the slightest sound. Even the livestock in the fields, usually calm and indifferent, appeared uneasy, eyes wide and ears twitching at every stir of the wind. Animals do not lie. They react to danger long before people perceive it, and their behavior lingers in the memory of a place long after the threat has passed. Whatever had happened in Hoer Verde, the animals had felt it. They had survived it, but only just, left behind as mute witnesses to an event no one could name. For the travellers, the sight of the animals only deepened the impossibility of the mystery. People could vanish, yes. They could be taken or choose to leave. But animals left behind alive and untended told a different story. They told of a departure that was sudden, chaotic, and absolute. And if the people had truly walked away, they had done so without the tools, food, and creatures that had always been essential to their survival. It was as if the villagers had not simply left, but been torn out of their own lives in an instant, leaving only their animals behind to mark the absence. The travellers who stumbled into Hoer Verde may not have had the language to place what they saw within a larger pattern, but in time, historians and storytellers would. For Hoer Verde was not the first community to vanish without explanation, and it would not be the last. Across centuries and continents, the earth holds other stories of disappearances that echo the same chilling silence. The most famous, of course, is the lost colony of Roanoke. In 1587, more than 100 settlers carved a life into the wilderness of the New World. When ships returned 3 years later, the colony was gone. Homes were dismantled, belongings abandoned, and the only clue left behind was a single word carved into a post: Croatoan. Like Hoer Verde, the colonists vanished without a trace, leaving behind speculation that still grips imaginations centuries later. Far from North America, in the frozen lands of Canada, there is the legend of the Angikuni Lake disappearance. In the 1930s, a trapper reportedly came upon a village where hundreds of Inuit had lived. But when he arrived, every dwelling was empty, every fire extinguished, every soul gone. Even sled dogs were found dead and half buried in snow. Some dismissed it as fabrication, but others could not ignore the similarities. Entire communities wiped clean, as though swallowed by the earth itself. The sea holds its own ghosts as well. The Mary Celeste, discovered adrift in the Atlantic in 1872, carried its cargo intact and its sails rigged, yet the crew had vanished. Meals were left uneaten, charts laid open on the table. It was a ship frozen in mid-journey, emptied of its human presence, its silence echoing the same strange interruption that seemed to hover over Hoer Verde. What binds these mysteries together is not just the disappearance of people, but the way in which life was left behind, unfinished, interrupted, abruptly cut short. Meals abandoned, tools dropped, words left half-written. Each case carries with it the same unbearable absence of closure. For Hoer Verde, these comparisons make the story both more believable and more haunting. It was not alone. There have been other vanishings, other places where communities have dissolved into the unknown. And yet, each time the trail ends the same way. Silence, speculation, and a single question that grows heavier with every retelling. Where did they go? For a mystery so vast, it is striking how few voices remain to tell of Hoer Verde. No official documents survive, no government records acknowledge its disappearance. What we have instead are fragments, stories passed from mouth to mouth, recollections from travellers who claim to have walked the empty streets, and retellings that blur fact with memory. These testimonies are fragile, yet they are all we have, and each one paints the mystery in slightly different shades. Some of the earliest accounts describe the travellers who first stumbled into the village, men moving between settlements who expected to trade and rest, but instead found only silence. Their words, recorded much later, spoke of food left uneaten, homes abandoned in haste, and the message on the chalkboard that seemed to carry the weight of doom. They described fear that clung to them long after they left, fear that what had consumed Hoer Verde might follow them home. Other accounts come not from witnesses, but from those who lived in nearby communities. Farmers claimed they had noticed strange stillness in the days before the village was found empty, saying no smoke rose from chimneys, no sound of labour carried across the hills. One woman, in a tale told years after, swore she had seen figures moving in the jungle at night, many figures, walking in silence, their shapes lit only by the pale glow of the moon. Whether these were the missing villagers or shadows of imagination, no one could say. With time, the stories multiplied. Some spoke of soldiers silencing the truth, of authorities erasing the incident from records. Others suggested the story itself was exaggerated, a folktale born from fear of the jungle. The testimonies rarely agreed on details, yet they all shared one constant, the sense of impossibility. The people of Hoer Verde had not simply left, they had disappeared. What makes these accounts so haunting is not their consistency, but their contradictions. They are like shards of a broken mirror, each reflecting a piece of something larger, but never showing the whole. And the more the story passed between lips, the more it became both history and legend, tangled together in a way that no one could separate. And then there is the strangest part of all, the missing records. Accounts that suggest the story once existed in writing, only to vanish, just as these villagers did. Perhaps the most unsettling layer of the Hoer Verde mystery is not just the disappearance of its people, but the disappearance of the story itself. For an event so extraordinary, an entire community wiped from existence, one might expect newspapers, police reports, government investigations. And yet, there is nothing. No surviving documents speak of Hoer Verde in 1923. No officials ever recorded the mass vanishing of 600 souls. It is as if the village never existed at all. This absence has fueled speculation for decades. Some believe that records once did exist, but were deliberately suppressed. Brazil at the time was politically unstable, and a story of this scale could have stoked panic across the countryside. Imagine the effect, villagers everywhere hearing that a community not unlike their own had vanished overnight, without explanation. Fear spreads faster than truth, and fear is a dangerous thing for governments already fighting to maintain order. According to this theory, silence was enforced not because the truth was known, but because it was too dangerous to admit that it was not. Others take an even darker view, that whatever befell Hoer Verde was not natural, and that those in power sought to bury the truth before it could take root. A military experiment gone wrong, a disease with no cure, or an incident tied to forces that could not be explained. If any of these had been the case, then wiping the village from official memory would have been the only way to contain the terror. And yet, the possibility must also be raised that the absence of records is simply evidence of myth. Perhaps Hoer Verde is less a historical event than a folk tale that grew with the telling, whispered into life by frightened voices until it became indistinguishable from fact. A story born in the shadows, carried on the tongues of travellers, but never set down in ink because it never truly happened. But if that were true, why does the story persist? Why does it appear not only in local tales but in distant retellings, always carrying the same details, the empty homes, the abandoned meals, the chalkboard with its grim message? Legends may evolve, but they do not usually hold such stubborn consistency. The missing people of Hoer Verde are a mystery, but perhaps the missing records are just as chilling. For silence itself can be an answer, and sometimes the absence of truth speaks louder than truth ever could. When ordinary explanations collapse under their own contradictions, people turn to the extraordinary. And so it is with Hoer Verde. For many, the absence of violence, the lack of trails, the suddenness of the disappearance, and the eerie chalkboard message point to something beyond the realm of human understanding. In whispered conversations and speculative accounts, the name of Hoer Verde often appears alongside tales of the paranormal. Some claim the villagers were taken by forces not of this earth. The 1920s were decades before flying saucers became part of popular culture. Yet even then, strange lights in the sky were reported across rural Brazil. Could it be that Hoer Verde was the site of a mass abduction, its people swallowed by something from beyond our world? 600 men, women and children lifted into the unknown, their homes left untouched, their animals ignored, their final message a cry against a fate they could not comprehend. Others suggest the village fell victim to a rift in reality itself. Portals, they say, open and close at the edges of the world, gateways into other realms where time and space twist into shapes we cannot imagine. If such a rift tore open near Hoer Verde, perhaps the villagers were drawn into it, whether by accident or by design, and simply ceased to exist in our world. Their possessions remained, but their lives slipped into another dimension, leaving behind only the echo of their absence. Still others turn to the supernatural traditions of the land itself. They speak of spirits that walk the jungle, ancient forces tied to the earth that occasionally claim entire communities. If the villagers believed they had offended such powers, the words on the chalkboard, "There is no salvation," take on a terrible weight. Not just despair, but acknowledgement. Not just a message, but surrender. Skeptics dismiss these theories as fantasy, the inevitable consequence of trying to explain the unexplainable. But legends endure because they touch something deeper than fact. The paranormal may not be provable, but in the case of Hoer Verde, it is at least as convincing as any earthly explanation. For what natural force can make 600 people disappear, leaving behind only the shadow of their lives? Among the most enduring explanations whispered about Hoer Verde is the idea that the village fell under a curse. In rural Brazil, where folklore runs deep, curses are not dismissed as superstition, but treated with caution, as possibilities woven into the fabric of daily life. For some, the story of Hoer Verde was not simply a tragedy, it was a judgment. The jungle has long been seen as a place of balance. It provides food, water and shelter, but it demands respect. Those who take too much, who cut too deep, or who dishonor the land, are said to invite consequences. In some versions of the tale, Hoer Verde's people are accused of just that. Stripping the forest for farmland, cutting trees without rituals, ignoring the spirits said to dwell in roots and rivers. If so, then the disappearance was not random but punishment, a retribution delivered with absolute silence. Religious voices interpret it differently. In a deeply Catholic country, the words on the chalkboard, "There is no salvation," echo like a final sermon. Some imagine a priest or a desperate villager writing them in recognition that God had abandoned the community. Perhaps the people had turned away from faith or committed some hidden sin, and the disappearance was divine judgment. The chalkboard was not a warning, but a confession. Others see the phrase as a curse in itself, a deliberate invocation meant to seal the village's fate. Curses in Brazilian folklore often take the form of words spoken or written with intent, words that carry power beyond their surface. If someone within Hoer Verde believed their world was doomed, writing, "There is no salvation," may have been more than despair. It may have been a spell, an act of surrender that called doom upon them all. The unsettling detail about curses is how they linger. Unlike natural disasters or political unrest, curses leave behind no evidence that can be studied. No clues to dissect. They exist only in the stories of those who believe them, and belief itself can make them real in the minds of entire communities. For skeptics, this is nothing more than fear taking shape. But for others, it explains the silence of Hoer Verde,
better than anything else. A people who vanished without struggle. A message of doom left behind. And the jungle, watching in silence, as if it had claimed what was owed. For all the mystery and speculation surrounding Hoer Verde, there are those who argue the story belongs not to history, but to myth. Skeptics insist that an event as dramatic as the disappearance of 600 people could not have passed without record, without mention in official archives, without so much as a newspaper report to anchor it in fact. To them, the silence of history is not evidence of suppression, but of invention. They point out that no government document refers to Hoer Verde, no maps bear its name with certainty, and no photographs exist to prove its presence. If such a village did exist, it left behind remarkably little trace. No graves, no ruins, no registry of births or marriages that tie its people to the land. Some historians suggest that what we call Hoer Verde may have been little more than a cluster of families, its name inflated by retellings, its population exaggerated until the story became larger than life. The chalkboard message, too, raises suspicion. Skeptics argue that it is almost too perfect, too hauntingly symbolic to be real. A community vanishing without a trace is already uncanny. Add to it a phrase like, "there is no salvation," and the story shifts from mystery into legend, carrying the polished weight of a folk tale. To them, this is a sign not of authenticity, but of myth-making, the human instinct to shape an eerie story into something unforgettable. And yet, even within skepticism, there lingers unease. If the story of Hoer Verde were nothing more than rumor, why has it endured for so long, and with such consistent details? Why do accounts from different voices, decades apart, repeat the same images? Abandoned homes, half-prepared meals, restless animals, the chalkboard with its chilling words. Legends often bend and shift with time, details mutating as they are passed along. But the story of Hoer Verde remains strangely rigid, as though rooted in some hidden truth that resists alteration. For skeptics, Hoer Verde may be no more than a ghost story, born in a time of turmoil and carried forward as a tale of caution. Yet even they admit that the legend itself has power. Real or not, it unsettles because it touches the deepest fear of all, that people can vanish into silence, leaving nothing but questions behind. Even if Hoer Verde were nothing more than a folk tale, it would not explain why its story has endured for so long, whispered across decades, repeated by storytellers, and compared to the greatest mysteries of history. Part of the answer lies in the nature of unsolved vanishings themselves. They draw us in because they resist closure, leaving behind a wound that never heals. We crave resolution, but when none comes, our minds fill the silence with endless speculation. There is something uniquely unsettling about disappearance. Death, even when tragic, has finality. A body, a grave, a record of passing, these give us certainty. But when people vanish, when they simply dissolve into absence, the imagination refuses to rest. Where did they go? Did they suffer? Are they still out there somewhere, hidden beyond our sight? It is the uncertainty that haunts us more than anything else, and it is uncertainty that Hoer Verde offers in abundance. The details only deepen the fascination. Meals half-prepared, tools dropped mid-use, livestock left untended. These are not just signs of absence, but signs of interruption. They tell us that life was unfolding in its ordinary rhythm when something extraordinary intruded. And the chalkboard, with its final words of despair, seals the mystery with an almost theatrical weight. It is as though the story was designed to lodge itself in memory, impossible to dismiss, impossible to forget. Psychologists argue that our attraction to such tales is tied to fear. We fear losing control, fear vanishing without explanation, fear that order can dissolve into chaos in an instant. When we hear of a community like Hoer Verde disappearing, we are forced to confront the fragile foundations of our own lives. If it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. And so the legend persists, not because it offers answers, but because it refuses to. Every telling renews the question. Every retelling passes the chill of uncertainty to another generation. In this way, Hoer Verde is less a story of the past than a mirror held to the present, a reminder that silence itself can be the loudest sound of all. It is easy to speak of Hoer Verde in numbers. 600 gone, 600 vanished. But behind that number were lives, families, neighbors, children, each with routines, dreams, and stories that ended in silence. To imagine what happened is to strip away the abstraction and see them not as a faceless crowd, but as people caught in a final moment none of them could have understood. Picture a farmer in his field, sweat on his brow, gripping the worn handle of a plough. The soil turns beneath him, the sun climbs higher, and suddenly he drops the tool, never to touch it again. Imagine a mother in her kitchen, stirring a pot of beans while her child tugs at her sleeve, asking when lunch will be ready. The food simmers, the bread waits to be cut, but the meal is never served. Somewhere else, a boy sits at his school desk, chalk dust on his fingers, his eyes fixed on the blackboard as his teacher guides him through a lesson. The letters trail off, abandoned mid-word, and the boy never finishes writing. Each of these moments ended at once, like a play where the actors all left the stage at the same time. No curtain fell, no applause sounded, only silence. The belongings left behind speak of interruption so sudden that no one had time to think, let alone plan. And that raises the most terrifying question of all. What force could sweep through a village in a single instant, removing 600 lives without leaving a single body behind? To walk through Hoer Verde was to walk among ghosts, not spirits, but the echoes of ordinary people caught in her extraordinary fate. Every half-sliced loaf of bread was someone's last act. Every unfinished lesson was someone's last moment of learning. Every empty cradle, every silent field, every door left open spoke not only of absence, but of lives left incomplete. Perhaps the villagers went willingly, following some unseen call. Perhaps they were driven by fear, leaving everything behind in their rush to escape. Or perhaps they had no choice at all, pulled from their homes by a force that did not allow preparation. Whatever the truth, the human cost of Hoer Verde is what makes the mystery so haunting. For it was not just 600 lives that vanished, but the stories they carried, cut short in the middle of a sentence. Of all the details that survived from Hoer Verde, none is more chilling than the 4 words left on the chalkboard. There is no salvation. It is the kind of phrase that clings to the imagination, heavy with despair, yet open to endless interpretation. Its meaning depends on who wrote it and in whose voice we choose to hear it. Was it a warning, a confession, a curse, or something more? To some, the phrase is unmistakably religious. In a nation where faith ran deep, the words evoke the finality of damnation, the recognition that God's grace had been withdrawn. Perhaps the villagers believed they had been abandoned spiritually, that whatever fate awaited them lay beyond redemption. In this reading, the chalkboard becomes a sermon written in desperation, a final message of hopelessness before the community dissolved. Others interpret the words as something more personal, the cry of one individual, overwhelmed by terror, scrawling their despair before fleeing. In this version, the phrase does not represent the voice of 600, but of one. A teacher perhaps left alone in a silent classroom, or a villager who lingered a moment longer than the rest. The words become less a prophecy than a reflection of a single soul's collapse. And then there are darker possibilities. What if the phrase was not meant for the villagers at all, but for those who would come after? There is no salvation, not for Hoer Verde, but for those who dared to step into its silence. A warning carved into chalk, meant to ripple outward like a curse, carrying dread into every ear that hears it. If this were true, then the words are not an explanation of what happened, but a continuation of it, the mystery extending beyond the village itself, infecting all who speak its name. What unsettles most is the deliberate nature of the message. It was not a rushed scrawl, not the handwriting of someone fleeing in panic. It was firm, clear, deliberate. Someone took the time to write it, knowing it would outlast them, and in doing so, they ensured that Hoer Verde's silence would never truly be empty. For what was left behind was not just absence, but a voice, one that whispers across a century, reminding us that some fates cannot be escaped. In the years since Hoer Verde first entered whispered accounts, it has become a point of contention, not only among storytellers, but among historians and researchers as well. Some approach the tale with sober conviction, convinced that the disappearance was real, even if the details have grown distorted with time. Others dismiss it outright, branding it as folklore, an eerie tale that spread through rural Brazil and took on a life of its own, until people forgot where the story ended and where truth began. Those who argue for Hoer Verde's authenticity point to the consistency of the accounts. Though no official records remain, the details are remarkably stubborn. Abandoned meals, tools left mid-use, animals wandering untended, and above all, the chalkboard message. Folklore tends to shift with the telling, mutating with each generation, but Hoer Verde's story has resisted change. To these researchers, that very consistency suggests a core of truth, something too real to be erased entirely, even by silence. Skeptics counter with an equally firm stance. They argue that consistency proves nothing. It may simply be the result of a story retold so often that its core elements became fixed, just as the story of Roanoke endures with the word Croatoan, etched forever at its center. They point to the lack of maps, registries, or documents, insisting that no village of 600 could disappear without at least a trace in official archives. To them, Hoer Verde is not history but allegory, a tale born in a time of political unrest, shaped into a warning about instability and carried forward because it captured a universal fear. Between these two camps lies a third view, that Hoer Verde may have existed, but not as the story claims. Perhaps it was smaller than the legend suggests, its population exaggerated, its disappearance less sudden than retold. In this interpretation, the story is neither complete fact nor pure fiction, but something in between. A real village swallowed by rumor until it grew into myth. What unites all sides is not agreement, but fascination. Whether true or not, Hoer Verde remains powerful because it embodies the unsolvable, and in that sense, historians and skeptics alike are left standing in the same silence as the travelers who first entered the village, searching for answers that may never come. As the decades passed, the mystery of Hoer Verde did not fade. It grew, and with it came a procession of investigators, journalists, and seekers of the strange, each hoping to peel back the silence and discover what lay at its heart. For some, it was an academic pursuit, an attempt to anchor a legend, in fact. For others, it was something darker, a personal obsession with the unknown. Journalists in the mid-20th century searched for traces of the village in archives and libraries, scouring newspapers from the 1920s for any mention of the event. They found noth. Aang. Not a single article reported the disappearance of 600 people. To skeptics, this was proof of fabrication. But for those already convinced, the absence of records only deepened the mystery. If such an event had been deliberately suppressed, would this silence not be exactly what one would expect? Amateur researchers traveled into Brazil itself, hunting for locals who might remember Hoer Verde or who had heard whispers of its fate. In isolated communities, they gathered fragments of oral tradition. Some elders recalled hearing of a village that had gone quiet, its people lost to the forest. Others spoke of soldiers passing through, of rumors that families had been marched away. None of these accounts were conclusive, but together they created a tapestry of memory, ragged, inconsistent, yet strangely persistent. In more recent years, paranormal investigators have embraced Hoer Verde as one of history's great enigmas. Writers of the unexplained compare it to Roanoke, to the Mary Celeste, to the Anjikuni Lake legend, holding it up as further evidence that human beings sometimes vanish on a scale too vast for reason. For these storytellers, the details of the case, abandoned meals, restless animals, the chalkboard message, become symbols of the thin line between the known and the unknowable. Even today, enthusiasts continue the search, combing through old maps, hunting for any trace of a settlement that might once have borne the name Hoer Verde. Some claim to have found sites that could match the description, little more than overgrown foundations hidden in the forest. Others argue that no such ruins exist, that the village belongs entirely to legend. And yet, whether real or not, the mystery remains alive, not in records, but in minds. For each person who seeks it, Hoer Verde becomes something personal, a question that resists answers, a silence that demands to be filled. Why do stories like Hoer Verde endure? Why do we return, again and again, to places where answers do not exist? The truth is that mysteries speak to something deep within the human spirit. They unsettle us because they refuse resolution. They remind us that no matter how much we study, record, or control, the world still harbors silences that cannot be explained. Part of the allure lies in fear. Disappearances are not just tragedies. They are intrusions into the natural order. We accept that people die, that communities fade with time. But to vanish entirely, to leave behind no bodies, no graves, no explanations, that is something different. It suggests the world is capable of erasing not only lives, but the proof that those lives ever existed. And if it could happen to 600 in Hoer Verde, what prevents it from happening again to any of us? But fascination is not only about fear, it is also about possibility. Mysteries create a space where the imagination is free to wander, to build explanations ranging from the rational to the impossible. A historian may see Hoer Verde as a village erased by politics, while a believer may see it as proof of the supernatural. Both find in it what they seek. Mysteries are mirrors, reflecting not only the unknown, but the desires and fears of those Watersees who look into them. There is also comfort, strangely, in the unsolved. To leave a story open-ended is to admit that the world is larger than us, that there are still secrets we cannot conquer. In an age where information flows constantly, where nearly everything is catalogued and archived, the idea that something as vast as an entire community can still defy explanation is both terrifying and oddly reassuring. It means the unknown is not gone. Hoer Verde endures not because we know what happened, but because we never will. Each retelling sharpens the same questions. Each listener fills the silence with their own fears and theories. And in this way, the village that vanished in 1923 never truly disappears. It lingers, not in the jungle where it once stood, but in the human mind, where mystery is the one force that never fades. Nearly a century has passed since the villagers of Hoer Verde are said to have vanished, and yet the place still lingers in whispers. Travelers who seek it today often find little more than overgrowth, foundations swallowed by vines, or ruins that may or may not have belonged to the village itself. Time has a way of erasing the marks of human presence, but in places tied to mystery, it never quite erases the atmosphere. Those who claim to have visited the site speak less of what they saw and more of what they felt. The jungle has reclaimed most of what once was. Narrow paths are now nothing but trails for animals, huts collapsed into piles of wood and clay, and the square that once rang with voices is a hollow clearing where silence settles too easily. The earth is alive with the sounds of insects and birds, yet there is a weight to the air, as though the land remembers what it held. Some who walk there say it feels as if they are being watched, not by people, but by the memory of people, as if 600 pairs of eyes still linger just beyond sight. Locals treat the place cautiously. Some insist the story is nothing more than legend, yet still refuse to go near it after dark. Others say the land is cursed,
pointing to the phrase left on the chalkboard as proof. "There is no salvation," they repeat, and then fall silent, unwilling to speculate further. Even those who dismiss the tale entirely acknowledge that the region carries a strange aura, a heaviness that marks it apart from other forgotten villages. Modern explorers, eager to uncover truth, often return with little more than fragments, half-ruined walls, traces of structures, the outlines of what might once have been a schoolhouse. But the more they look, the more they realize that the physical remains matter less than the silence itself. For it is not the ruins that keep Hoer Verde alive in memory. It is the story, the unanswered questions, the weight of 600 lives that left no trace. And so Hoer Verde exists in two places at once, in the forest, as soil and stone swallowed by green, and in the imagination, where it will never fade. The land has reclaimed the village, but the silence it left behind belongs to all of us. The story of Hoer Verde begins with silence, and it ends with silence. Nearly 100 years have passed since 600 men, women and children vanished overnight, leaving behind homes, belonged, jings, animals, and a phrase that still chills every retelling: "There is no salvation." Explanations have come and gone. Political unrest, military action, migration, disease, curses, even forces beyond this world. Yet none of them can account for the totality of what was left behind. None can explain how an entire community could disappear without bodies, without trails, without proof. What lingers is not clarity but absence. A village frozen mid-breath, a meal half-prepared, a child's lesson left unfinished, a chalkboard scrawled with words that echo across a century. These fragments tell us little of what truly happened, but they tell us enough to feel its weight. They tell us that life can be interrupted in an instant, and that some stories will never find their ending. Perhaps the people of Hoer Verde fled into the jungle, driven by fear we can no longer trace. Perhaps they were taken by soldiers whose actions were buried by silence, or perhaps something stranger still crept into the village that night, something no words could capture, leaving only a message of despair for those who would follow. We will never know. And maybe that is the cruelest part of all, that the questions endure, but the answers do not. Mysteries like Hoer Verde endure because they mirror our deepest fears. We fear not just death, but erasure. We fear vanishing without explanation, without remembrance, without salvation. And so this village, swallowed by time and silence, becomes more than a story of 600. It becomes a story of us all, a reminder that certainty is fragile, and that the unknown is never far away. You have been listening to the Macabre record. If the mystery of Hoer Verde unsettled you, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale of darkness and disappearance. And before you go, tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from. The village of Hoer Verde may be gone, but tonight its silence has reached you.